You don't belong at this table. My son-in-law said it quietly, almost pleasantly, like he was commenting on the weather. I was standing in my own kitchen doorway, holding the roasting pan I just pulled from my own oven, in the house I'd owned for 23 years. He said it like it was obvious, like I was the one who'd forgotten something. I hadn't forgotten anything. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. I'm 64 years old. I worked for 31 years as a structural engineer with a firm in Winnipeg. Bridges, overpasses, the kind of work that outlasts the people who do it. I retired in 2019, 2 years after my wife Janet passed from ovarian cancer. We'd bought our house on Balmoral Street in 1999. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard big enough for the garden Janet always wanted and never quite got to finish. When she died, I kept the garden going. Felt like the least I could do. My daughter, who I'll call my daughter throughout this because names don't matter, was 31 when this started. She'd married her husband, that's what I'll call him, 4 years before. He worked in residential renovation, running small contracts around the greater Winnipeg area. Or he had been. By the fall of 2021, his business was circling the drain. Supply chain problems, he said. Clients backing out of contracts. A dispute with a supplier that cost him more than he'd made in 2 years. I believed him. I had no reason not to. Dad, can we come stay with you? Just until we sort out the finances. It won't be long. My daughter called on a Tuesday evening. I just sat down with a cup of tea and a book. I remember that clearly. I set the book face down on the side table and I said, of course, sweetheart, come whenever you need. They arrived the following Saturday with a moving van. Not boxes, a moving van. I told myself that was practical. Better to move everything than to pay for storage. That was reasonable. That was fine. The first few months were genuinely good. My daughter helped with the cooking sometimes. Her husband fixed the downstairs bathroom faucet without being asked. My grandson, he was 5 then, and he is the single best thing in this entire story, would sit with me in the evenings and watch hockey. He liked the Jets. I'd raised him right. But somewhere around month 4 or 5, something shifted. I noticed it the way you notice a door that's starting to stick, slowly. Then all at once, my daughter's husband began referring to the house as our place. Not your dad's place, not the house on Balmoral, our place. He had opinions about the living room furniture. He had opinions about the temperature I kept the house at. He started having his renovation clients over for meetings in the kitchen, spreading blueprints across my table, and when I came in for a glass of water, he'd look up with a faint expression of inconvenience, like I'd interrupted something important. Month 7. I was watching the evening news when he walked in and changed the channel without asking. I looked at him. He looked at the TV. He said, "Sorry, are you watching that?" But he didn't change it back. Month 11. My daughter mentioned, during a phone call with a friend, I overheard, I wasn't eavesdropping, that things were a bit cramped living with her dad. She said it with a sigh, the kind of sigh that carries years of accumulated complaint. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed and I thought about Janet. I thought about what she would have said. She had a way of cutting through things. She would have said, "You're letting them make you small. Stop it." But I didn't stop it, because she was my daughter, because the boy needed stability, because I kept thinking they were almost back on their feet, any month now, any month. Any month stretched into 2 years. By the time Thanksgiving of 2023 arrived, I had spent somewhere in the range of $38,000 subsidizing their lives. Not all at once, the large amounts would have been easy to see. It was the accumulation of small things. $11,000 I'd lent her husband directly when a contract fell through, money he promised to repay within a year. Monthly groceries I paid entirely because we shared a household and it seemed petty to split them, but they ate more than I did and he had opinions about expensive cuts of beef. Utility bills that had doubled. Property tax I paid while he was, in his words, between projects. A transmission repair on their truck. A car seat for my grandson when theirs cracked. I kept a notebook. Not because I suspected anything, because I was an engineer for 30 years. I document things. It's a reflex. The Thanksgiving dinner of 2023 is where it broke. I've been cooking since 8 in the morning. Turkey, Stuffing with apple and sage, roasted sweet potatoes, green beans, a pumpkin pie from scratch. My daughter had said she'd help with the vegetables. She hadn't come downstairs yet. It was noon. Her husband's brother was coming, and a couple they befriended through the renovation work. 4 guests I'd never met. I'd set the dining room table with the china. Janet and I had bought in Quebec City on our 20th anniversary. White with a blue border, more beautiful every year. When the guests arrived, her husband greeted them at the door. My door. He had a beer in his hand, and he was laughing loudly, and he walked them through the house pointing out the renovations he'd done, the bathroom faucet, some trim work in the hallway, as if he were giving a tour of something he'd built. One of the guests said, "Great place, man. How long have you been here?" "A few years," he said. "We've really made it our own." I was standing at the kitchen counter listening to this. I kept my face neutral. My grandson found me before dinner. He was 7 by then, old enough to sense the temperature of a room. He climbed up onto the stool beside me and said, "Grandpa, did you cook everything?" "I did." He said, "That's a lot." And then, quieter, "Dad didn't help." "I know, buddy." He leaned against my arm. I let him. Dinner was set for 2 o'clock. I brought the turkey out on the platter, 20 pounds, golden, the smell filling every room, and I set it on the table. Her husband made a show of carving it, standing at the head of my table with my carving knife, accepting compliments he hadn't earned. I pulled out the chair at the other end, the chair I'd sat in for 23 years. Janet's chair had always been to my left. I sat in the same spot every year, every holiday, every Sunday dinner, every birthday, every quiet evening alone since she'd been gone. My hand was on the back of the chair when her husband looked up from the turkey. He said, "Actually, we need that seat for Ray." I said, "Pardon?" He nodded down the table. "Ray's family is coming, last minute. We're short a chair. Maybe you could eat in the kitchen." The table went quiet, not fully. There was still the sound of wine being poured, someone adjusting a napkin, but the conversation died in a spreading circle outward from where we stood. My daughter was looking at her plate. I want you to understand what that means. She was looking at a plate, a mother's china. The plate I'd washed and dried and put away carefully for 20 years. She was looking at it, and she was not saying anything. Her husband picked up the carving knife again, turned back to the turkey, like it was settled. Like I was already gone. I felt something settle in my chest. It wasn't anger exactly, it was clarity. The kind of clarity you get when a structure you've been assessing finally reveals the crack you'd been looking for. There it is. That's the failure point. I let go of the chair. I walked back through the dining room, through the kitchen, to the front hallway. I got my coat off the hook by the door. My grandson had followed me. He was standing in the kitchen doorway watching me with wide, serious eyes. I said, "I'm going to step out for a bit. Save me some pie." His lip trembled. He nodded. I stepped outside. It was cold. Winnipeg in October is not forgiving. Maybe -6 with the wind coming off the flat land west of the city. I stood on my front step in my own coat in front of my own house, and I breathed for a moment. Then I walked to my car, drove 3 blocks to a Tim Hortons, and sat down with a double-double and my phone. I called my friend from the old engineering days. He's been my closest friend since 1987, the kind of man who answers on the second ring and doesn't ask how you're doing before he asks what happened. I told him everything, the 2 years, the money, the table, the chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to finish my coffee. Then I'm going to go home and do what I should have done a year ago." I drilled back. Her husband's truck and 2 other cars were in my driveway. I parked on the street. I went inside. The dinner was still in progress. Plates were full. Wine was flowing. Her husband was telling a loud story to Ray, and whoever Ray was. My daughter looked up when I came in. There was something in her face, relief, guilt. I couldn't read it. I stood in the living room doorway and I waited until the conversation paused. I said, "I'd like everyone's attention for a moment." The room quieted. I said, "I'm Leonard. This is my house. I bought it in 1999, and it's in my name, and I've owned it for 24 years. I've been happy to have family here. That welcome has now ended. I'm asking my daughter and her husband to have their belongings out within 30 days. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who are not part of a conflict, but have suddenly found themselves inside one. Ray's wife set down her fork. Someone coughed. Her husband laughed. Nervous, disbelieving, he looked around the table for support and found none. She put down her glass. "Leonard," he said, "and the use of my name, flat like that. No title, no warmth. You're being insane. We live here." "Your guests," I said. "I'm withdrawing the invitation. 30 days." I walked to my study and closed the door. The guests left within 20 minutes. I heard the cars start and pull away. I heard voices in the hallway, urgent and low. I heard my grandson's feet on the stairs. My daughter knocked on the study door. She came in and she stood in front of me and she said, "Dad, you can't do this. Where are we supposed to go?" I said, "That's a fair question to ask yourself. I'd start asking it." She cried. I'd expected that. I sat through it. When she was done, I said, "I love you. But this is my home. You have 30 days. The next morning, I called a property lawyer. A colleague of mine from the engineering world had used a woman in the Exchange District. Sharp, direct, the kind of lawyer who doesn't waste your time or hers. I explained the situation. She explained my rights. In Manitoba, even without a formal lease, a person who has resided in a property for more than a few months is considered a tenant and has tenancy rights under the Residential Tenancies Act. That meant I couldn't just change the locks at 30 days. I had to serve formal notice under the Act. "That's fine," I said. "Do it properly." She filed a notice to vacate the same week. 60 days, as the Act required for a no-fault eviction, served by registered mail and hand delivery. Her husband's response was to call me from the driveway at 11 o'clock at night, standing outside his truck, voice loud enough that my neighbor later mentioned it. "You're going to regret this. We have rights. We've been here 2 years. You owe us." I stood at my bedroom window and watched him. I didn't go down. He hired a tenant-side paralegal, not a lawyer, a paralegal, which told me something about the budget situation. Who sent a letter claiming they had established tenancy and were entitled to additional notice periods and potentially compensation for disruption. I sent the letter to my lawyer. She sent back a response that was 3 pages long, and, she later told me, enjoyed writing. The residential tenancies branch hearing was scheduled for a Monday in February, small claims style, both parties presenting to a hearing officer, no judge, relatively informal. I brought my notebook. 2 years of dates and amounts. I brought the original loan document her husband had signed in March of 2022, the one with his signature acknowledging $11,000 at an agreed repayment schedule. I brought utility bills. I brought the email my daughter had sent me 8 months before, thanking me for letting us stay in your house, Dad. Your house. The paralegal presented their case. Long-term residency, established roots, my grandson's school enrollment in the neighborhood, disruption to the child. The hearing officer was a woman in her 50s, patient, thorough, the kind of person who had seen every version of this situation. She asked the paralegal, "Do the respondents have a signed lease?" "No." "Have they paid rent at any point during the 2-year period?" "No." "Are there any financial contributions to household expenses documented?" The paralegal shuffled papers. There were some informal arrangements. The hearing officer looked at me. I slid the utility bills across the table, then the grocery receipts, then the loan document, then the email. She read for a while. She said, "Mr. Leonard," and she used my last name with my first, respectful. "The notice was served correctly under the Act. The tenancy is at will. The eviction stands. 60 days from date of service." Her husband stood up. "This is our home. We have a child in school here. You can't just—" The hearing officer said his name once, quietly. He sat down. They had until mid-March. "I want to tell you something about that period, the 2 months between the hearing and when they actually left. My daughter and I didn't speak much. She moved through the house quietly, avoiding me, which was both painful and easier than I'd expected. Her husband was hostile in small ways, leaving dishes in the sink, taking up the driveway so I had to park on the street, playing music loudly after 10 at night. Juvenile things. Things designed to make me feel the cost of what I'd done. My grandson still came and sat with me in the evenings. Sometimes we watched hockey. Sometimes he sat at the kitchen table doing homework while I read. He didn't talk about what was happening. He was 8 years old and navigating it with more dignity than his father. The last night, he hugged me in the hallway. He was wearing his backpack, which seemed wrong, too small, too young to be carrying everything he owned. He said, "I'll come visit, Grandpa." I said, "Anytime. My door is always open to you. That's a promise." He nodded seriously. He believed me. I needed him to believe me. They left on the Wednesday morning in March. I watched from the kitchen window. Her husband didn't look back. My daughter paused on the front walk, turned, looked at the house for a moment, then she got in the car for a moment. Then she got in the car. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for 2 years. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table. I looked at Janet's photograph on the shelf. We'd taken it in Banff, the summer before her diagnosis, both of us laughing at something one of the kids at the next table had said. She was mid-laugh. It was her best picture. I thought she would have approved. I'd spent $38,000 over 2 years. The loan was $11,000 with a signed document. The rest, the groceries, the utilities, the truck repair, all of it, was harder to recover. My lawyer told me I could file in small claims court for the documented loan and potentially a portion of the utility overage. Manitoba small claims goes up to $10,000 per claim. I could file 2 separate claims, one for the loan, one for the cost of living overage, but collections would be another matter. If they had no assets, a judgment was just paper. I filed anyway, not because I expected to see the money, because documentation matters, because the record should be accurate. Her husband contested the first claim, then failed to show up to the hearing. Judgment for the plaintiff. $11,000. Registered against his name. He can't sell property, renew certain licenses, or collect certain government benefits until it's satisfied. It doesn't disappear. For the second claim, I filed for $6,000 in documented utility overage. He didn't respond at all. Default judgment. Another $6,000 on the record. He and my daughter separated in August. She called to tell me. Her voice was flat, exhausted, like someone at the end of a very long shift. She said, "I didn't know he'd signed that loan document. He told me you'd given us the money as a gift. He told me a lot of things." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I understand now what happened. What I let happen." There was a silence between us that had weight to it, not empty exactly, more like a room after something has been moved, the impression still visible in the carpet. I said, "You're my daughter. That doesn't end." She said, "I know. I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know you are." We've met 3 times since then. Coffee once, dinner once, my grandson's school concert in December. It's slow. It's careful. It's nothing like before, which makes sense because before wasn't what I thought it was either. We're building something different. I don't know what it will become, but I'm willing to find out. My friend came over on the Saturday after they left. We sat on the back porch with coffee, even though it was still cold enough to see our breath. He'd brought butter tarts from a bakery on Portage, the good ones with the runny centers. He said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Lighter." He said, "That's it, just lighter." I thought about it. I said, "I feel like myself again, like I walked back into a room I'd been locked out of." He said, "You know, most people wouldn't have held out that long. 2 years is a long time to let something go that far." I said, "I know. I thought I was being patient. I thought patience was the same as love. It's not." He said, "What's the difference?" I said, "Patience waits for someone to change. Love tells them the truth, so they have the chance to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up a butter tart and said, "That's either very wise or something you read on a fridge magnet." I said, "Can't it be both?" He laughed. First real laugh I'd heard in that backyard in 2 years. It sounded like the right sound for a Saturday morning. It sounded like mine. The garden came back that spring. I'd let it go a little during everything. Not badly, but enough. I turned the soil in late April, put in tomatoes and beans and the same kind of lavender Janet had planted along the south fence. My grandson helped on the Saturday visit, taking the job seriously, patting soil around seedlings with both hands. He asked me, "Grandpa, why did they have to leave?" I thought about the right way to answer that. He was 8. He deserved honesty shaped for 8. I said, "Sometimes when you let people stay in your house for a long time, they forget that it's your house. That's not all their fault. Sometimes you forget to remind them." He thought about that. He said, "So you reminded them?" I said, "I did." He nodded. He seemed satisfied with that. He went back to the lavender. The house on Balmoral was mine again. Every room, every doorway. The dining room table I'd sat at for 24 years. The chair at the head, the view from that seat toward the kitchen where Janet used to stand. All of it mine. I eat dinner there now, properly. I set a place. I sit down. Sometimes it's quiet, in a way that aches, but it's my quiet. It's honest. It's the life I built, with the person I built it with, and it belongs to no one else. That's not nothing. Some days it feels like everything. There's a moment in that Thanksgiving story that I keep coming back to, and it's not the big one. Not the dining room, not the hearing officer, not the day they drove away. It's smaller than that. It's the moment I stood on my own front step, in the cold, breath clouding in the October air, and thought, how did I let this go on for 2 years? That question matters more to me now than any of the legal outcomes. I think about the choices I made in those 2 years. The patient ones, the accommodating ones, the ones I told myself were generous. And they were generous at first. Letting families stay when they're struggling is the decent thing to do. I don't regret that instinct. What I regret is mistaking silence for kindness. Every time I swallowed a frustration, every time I watched him take the remote or introduce my home as his own and said nothing, I wasn't being kind. I was teaching him that there were no consequences. I was teaching my daughter that I could be diminished and it was fine. I was teaching my grandson, without meaning to, that this was how adults behaved, that you absorbed whatever was given to you and you carried it quietly. That's not decency, that's a failure of honesty. And honesty, I'd come to understand, is not the sharp thing we're taught to be careful with. It's the thing that holds a relationship together when everything else is pulling it apart. What finally moved me at that Thanksgiving table wasn't anger, it was clarity. 2 years of documentation, 2 years of watching the slow erosion of my own home, and it all resolved in one sentence from him, said so casually, so certain of my compliance, and something in me simply said, no, not because I'd worked myself up to it, because I finally saw it plainly for what it was. That's what I mean when I think about the difference between patience and good judgment. Patience without judgment isn't a virtue, it's a slow surrender. Knowing when to hold and when to act. That takes something harder than endurance. It takes the willingness to see clearly, even when what you're seeing is painful. And then there's the matter of following through, filing the notice, attending the hearing, filing the claims even when I wasn't sure I'd collect. A lot of people told me, kindly, well-meaningly, that I should let it go, that the money wasn't worth the conflict, that family should come before principle. But the two aren't opposites. Holding my daughter accountable was the most family-minded thing I did in that whole period. It told her more clearly than any conversation could that actions carry weight, that the people who love you are not exempt from consequences, that love and accountability are not in competition. My grandson is 9 now. He visits most Saturdays. He started asking questions about engineering, how bridges work, why some structures hold and others don't. I tell him it's all about understanding where the load goes. You have to know which parts of a structure are carrying weight they weren't designed for. When that happens, you don't ignore it and hope. You fix it before it fails. He nods very seriously when I explain this. I think he understands more than he lets on. The garden along the south fence is full this summer. The lavender Janet planted and I replanted, and my grandson helped tend has spread further than I expected. Some mornings I stand at the kitchen window with my tea and just look at it. The house is quiet, it's honest, it's mine. That's enough. Most days, it's more than enough.